Welcome to The Debate. Today, we're dissecting the life of a man who possessed, well, perhaps the sharpest pen and the sharpest tongue of the 20th century. We are talking about Evelyn Waugh. To the literary world, he's a titan. The mind behind Brideshead Revisited and Scoop, a stylist whose sentences were just these architectural marvels. But to the people who actually had to sit across from him at dinner, he was often something else entirely. His contemporary James Lees Milne famously called him the nastiest tempered man in England.
Honestly, based on the evidence, Lees Milne might have been holding back a little. It's a pleasure to be here, though. We've got a heavy lift today. We're looking at a figure who is just incredibly difficult to pin down. On one side, you have this devout Catholic convert and a brilliant satirist. On the other, you have a man accused of profound snobbery, anti-Semitism, and a cruelty that seemed to go far, far beyond simple grumpiness.
And that's the tension we're here to explore. The central question for this session is this. Was Evelyn Waugh genuinely a misanthropic monster whose work just reflects a disdain for humanity? Or was that famous crusty colonel persona actually a protective mask worn by a deeply sensitive moralist who was frankly terrified of the modern world? I'm arguing for the latter. I believe Waugh was a misunderstood figure who used performance and humor to shield a fragile self, and that his work is a serious, even desperate search for grace in a chaotic world.
And I'm taking the opposing view. I think the mask theory is a convenient fiction we tell ourselves so we can enjoy the books without feeling guilty about the author. I'll be arguing that Waugh's brilliance simply cannot excuse his genuine cruelty. I intend to show that the mask wasn't hiding anything. It was magnifying the truth. His character was marked by a fundamental, uncharitable hostility toward his fellow man.
I understand why you'd say that. The stories about him are legendary. But to really get Waugh, I think you have to start with the wound. You cannot understand the bark without understanding the bite he took early on. We have to look at 1929. He's married to Evelyn Gardner. They were known as he Evelyn and she Evelyn. And by all accounts, he was completely besotted. Then she confesses she has a lover. The marriage implodes. And it wasn't just a breakup, it was a total shattering of his reality.
It was certainly a catalyst, I'll give you that. But plenty of people get divorced without becoming, tyrants.
But for Waugh, it was the foundation of his entire worldview shift. It was right after this betrayal, in 1930, that he converted to Catholicism. And later, he wrote something that I think is the key to his entire psyche. He said life was unintelligible and unendurable without God. Now, that is not the statement of an arrogant man. That's the statement of a man hanging over an abyss. His biographer, Selina Hastings, made this brilliant observation about his belligerence. She suggested his hostility wasn't pure malice. It was boredom and fear. He was terrified of the age of the common man, this rising tide of mediocrity that he felt was swallowing beauty and tradition. He was defending the fortress.
See, that paints him as this tragic, romantic figure defending civilization. But if we look at the timeline, the nastiness predates the heartbreak. You want to talk about the age of the common man? Let's talk about the age of the schoolboy. At Heathmount Preparatory School, long before any wife betrayed him, he was already a bully. He tormented Cecil Beaton, the future photographer, relentlessly. Beaton said he never forgot the cruelty. Now that is not defending a fortress against mediocrity. That's a child deriving pleasure from the pain of a weaker child.
Children can be cruel, though. Projecting the man onto the child is a bit risky.
But the line is unbroken. When his diaries were published in the 70s, which, by the way, destroyed his reputation for a whole new generation, they didn't reveal a secret heart of gold. They revealed a man who was deeply intolerant, anti-Semitic, and sadistic. Even his friends, the people who loved him, noted a shift. Christopher Sykes said a new hardness and bitterness took over after the divorce. It wasn't just sadness, it was aggression. And his politics, these were not witty paradoxes. He opposed the welfare state. He supported Mussolini's invasion of Abyssinia because he thought it was a savage place that needed taming. That isn't a mask. Those are deeply held, problematic convictions.
I think we have to be careful about reading 2020's morality into 1930s politics, but let's look at where those convictions actually manifested, the work.
Because this is where the snobbery accusation usually lands, and it lands squarely on Brideshead Revisited.
Oh, it has to. Brideshead is the elephant in your room, published in 1945. It's his most famous book, but it's also the one where his mask slips in the wrong direction. Critics like Connor Cruz O'Brien absolutely savaged it for what he called mystical veneration of the upper classes. Waugh fell in love with the Ligon family at Madras Court, and in the book, he just conflates the aristocracy with holiness. It's as if he believes God only truly operates inside a gated country estate. He was so blinded by the glamour of the Flight family that he lost his satirical edge. He started worshiping the very people he used to mock.
I think that is a very superficial reading of Brideshead, though I admit many critics shared it at the time. But look closer. Is he worshiping them? Sebastian Flight is a severe alcoholic who ends up destitute in North Africa. Lord Marchmain is an adulterer living in sin who essentially abandoned his family. These aren't role models. Waugh isn't saying aristocrats are better. He's saying that divine grace is so powerful it can penetrate even the thickest walls of privilege and sin. Waugh himself said the book was about the operation of divine grace.
But he treats their sins with a romance he denies the lower classes. I mean, the deathbed scene of Lord Marchmain is treated with this profound solemnity, whereas the failures of common people in his books are just played for laughs.
I disagree. Compare it to Vile Bodies or Decline and Fall. In those early books, the bright young things, the aristocrats, are portrayed as vapid, empty, and futile. He saw through them completely. The shift in Brideshead isn't about worshiping money, it's about mourning the loss of a specific type of beauty. And let's look at who the real villain is in Brideshead. It's Hooper.
Exactly. Hooper, the young middle-class officer. Waugh treats him with absolute dripping contempt.
But why? Not because Hooper's poor, but because Hooper has no soul. Hooper represents the standardized man. He has no connection to history, no connection to the land, no connection to faith. He's plastic. Waugh hated Hooper because Hooper represented a world where nothing mattered except efficiency. You see the same thing with Trimmer in the Sword of Honor trilogy. Waugh wasn't attacking their bank accounts, he was attacking their spiritual mediocrity. He feared a world where everyone was Hooper, where the concept of honor or beauty was obsolete.
But that's exactly my point. His definition of spiritual depth is conveniently tied to having a family crest. It's an exclusionary theology. It implies that if you don't have ancestors in the peerage, you're spiritually vacant. And this brings me to the biggest hurdle I have with Waugh. You talk about grace and faith and the operation of God. How do you square that with his behavior? He was a devout Catholic, attended Mass faithfully, yet he was undeniably mean. There's that famous story with Nancy Mitford.
I know the one. She asked him, point blank, how he could behave so abominably while claiming to be a Christian.
Right. And his response?
He said, "You have no idea how much nastier I would be if I was not a Catholic. Without supernatural aid, I would hardly be a human being."
It's a brilliant line. It's witty. It's self-deprecating. But is it true? Or is it a get-out-of-jail-free card? It feels like he used his Catholicism as a way to say, oh, I'm trying, while continuing to be awful. It's almost a rhetorical trick to deflect criticism.
I believe he meant every word of it. Waugh viewed his own nature as a battleground. He suffered from what he called a dryness of soul. He didn't like himself very much. He knew he was prone to cruelty. The church gave him a structure, a cage, if you will, to keep the beast contained. And he was generous. He gave a lot of money to Catholic causes, often anonymously. He housed priests, he supported converts.
But even his generosity had a cynical edge. Look at how he handled his own children's inheritance. He set up a trust fund to avoid taxes, which is fine, practical, but he named it the Save the Children Fund. He appropriated the name of an actual charity for a tax dodge. That's a joke, sure, but it's a cruel one. It suggests he viewed moral obligations as something to be gained.
It was a dark joke, absolutely. He refused to take the state seriously. He viewed the modern government's attempt to replace the church's charity as a usurpation. But if we want to talk about his faith, we have to talk about the end of his life, the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s. This is where the monster narrative really falls apart for me, and you see the broken man.
When the church switched from Latin to English?
Yes. To many, that was progress. To Waugh, it was a catastrophe.
He wrote to Nancy Mitford, "The buggering up of the church is a deep sorrow to me." He wasn't just being a snob about language. He felt that the mystery was being stripped away. He felt his lifeline to God was being severed by bureaucrats. That is not the anger of a bully. That's the panic of a man whose sanctuary is being demolished.
Or it was the complaint of a man who treated the church like an exclusive club. He wanted the Latin Mass because it was aesthetic, because it was elite, because it separated the initiated from the common. It's the same reason he collected Victorian furniture before it was cool. It's all about curation. And that brings us to the persona itself. You say it was a mask. I look at that famous BBC face-to-face interview with John Freeman in 1960.
It's a painful interview to watch.
It is. Waugh sits there, puffing his cigar, affecting this pose of world-weary boredom. He refuses to engage. He treats Freeman like an insect. By the end of his life, he refused to drive, refused to use the telephone, hated the radio. That isn't a mask protecting a sensitive soul. That is a man who has retreated into a fantasy world because he cannot cope with reality. He became a caricature of himself.
I see it differently. I see it as consistent aesthetic conservatism. Waugh was an artist. He curated his life just as carefully as he curated his sentences. He bought William Burgess furniture and Victorian paintings when everyone else was buying modernism. He was living in a world of his own creation because the actual world had become ugly to him. It was a form of protest art.
But the protests often look like madness, or worse, inhumanity. Let's compare two incidents, and I think this really nails down why the mask theory fails. 1925, young Waugh attempts suicide. He walks into the sea, leaving a quote from Euripides on the beach. High drama.
And he turns back because he gets stung by a jellyfish. It's a moment of bathos he would have put in a novel himself.
Exactly. It's human. It's funny. But fast forward to 1958. His son, Oberon, is serving in the army in Cyprus. He's critically wounded in a machine gun accident. He nearly dies. Waugh's reaction? Radical, icy detachment. He doesn't fly to Cyprus. He barely reacts when Oberon eventually returns. He maintained a stiff upper lip that bordered on sociopathy. A father who curates his life to exclude the suffering of his own son isn't shielding a sensitive self. He is simply cold.
That is a hard charge to answer. Waugh's relationship with his children was, well, Victorian, to put it mildly. He was distant. But I would argue that this detachment was the only way he could function as a writer. He viewed writing as an external craft. He had to separate the man from the artist, or the emotion would overwhelm the prose. He famously said, "Man is a creature of the fall. Only the artist can achieve perfection."
But can we separate them? That's the ultimate question of his legacy. George Orwell, who Waugh actually admired, ironically, put it best. He said Waugh was about as good a novelist as one can be, while holding untenable opinions. We cannot just ignore the fascism in Waugh and Abyssinia. We cannot ignore the racial prejudices that his biographer David Wykes cataloged. These aren't just quirks, they seep into the ink.
They are there, and they are ugly. I won't defend the prejudice, but I will defend the utility of his perspective. Because he stood outside the modern world, he could see its cracks clearer than anyone else. Look at The Loved One.
His Hollywood satire?
Yes. He visits Forest Lawn Cemetery in Los Angeles. He sees the makeup on the corpses, the commercialization of grief, the total denial of death, and he writes a savage, brilliant satire. He exposes the artificiality of American culture. He saw that without a grounding in spiritual reality, specifically the reality of death and judgment, society becomes a grotesque carnival. That insight is more relevant today than it was in 1948. We need that nasty voice to prick our balloons.
I grant you The Loved One is a masterpiece. But why is it a masterpiece? V.S. Pritchett called it the beauty of his malice. My argument is that the malice is the engine. He didn't write The Loved One to save America. He wrote it because he despised America. The hate was the fuel. His worldview was fundamentally exclusionary. He wanted a hierarchy with him at the top looking down. That energy drives the humor in Scoop and Black Mischief. It's the humor of the bully who is smarter than everyone else in the room.
That is a compelling argument. Malice is fuel.
But I would argue that in his very best work, that malice turns inward. Look at the ordeal of Gilbert Penfold. He fictionalized his own mental breakdown. He wrote about hearing voices, about being paranoid. He told his friends, "I've been mad, clean off my onion." A man with zero self-awareness, a man who is just a bully, cannot write Penfold. He dismantled his own ego. And in Sword of Honor, the protagonist Guy Crouchback starts the war thinking it's a crusade and ends up realizing it's just a sweaty tug-of-war between teams of indistinguishable louts. Waugh dismantled his own romanticism. He was a man in constant spiritual combat with himself.
And yet, looking at the end of his life, it feels like he lost that combat. He died in 1966, on Easter Sunday, which is poetic, I suppose, but he died isolated, railing against the changes in his church, estranged from the culture.
I find it fitting. He died in the Latin rite he loved, in the home he curated, having finished his work.
So where does that leave us? I look at the diaries, the treatment of his family, the political tracts, and I see a man who was undeniably a genius of the English language, but fundamentally unpleasant. The mask defense fails for me, because if you wear a mask of cruelty for 40 years, eventually it fuses to your skin. His tragedy was that he could describe the world perfectly, but he couldn't find a way to love the people inhabiting it.
And I maintain that Evelyn Waugh was a man flayed alive by his own sensibilities. He was a perfectionist in a fallen world. His malice was a survival mechanism, a way to keep the dark disaster at bay. As Nancy Mitford said, everything with him was jokes. We mistake his desperate, defensive humor for pure hatred. He remains the grand old Mandarin, a man who took the chaos of the 20th century and imposed upon it the order of a perfectly constructed sentence.
We can certainly agree on the sentences. They are perfect.
They are. And perhaps, in the end, that has to be enough. Waugh represents that collision between exquisite artistic control and messy, often ugly human chaos.
A collision that leaves the reader to decide if the beauty justifies the malice.
Indeed. Thank you for joining the debate.